Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining us from California, Asia, and elsewhere. My name is Kyoteru Tsutsui, and I'm Deputy Director of the Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center. Welcome to the third event of APARC's Winter 2022 webinar series, New Frontiers, Technology, Politics, and Society in the Asia Pacific. This series focuses on technology and its political and social impact in Asia, and examines how advanced technologies are transforming social orders and international politics. The series covers a wide range of pressing issues, from great power contest to global trade and supply chains, and from rising digital authoritarianism to climate change solutions and digital healthcare. And our stellar guest speaker lineup that features leading academics and experts in their fields will examine the interconnections between technology and policy-relevant issues such as digital future in Southeast Asia, the US-China competition, innovations to address climate change, and more. And each event is led by one of APARC's research programs. And today, we are pleased to host a discussion on digital medicine, genetic information, and health technology assessment in 3 Asian countries, led by our Asia Health Policy Program. So without further ado, let me turn the virtual floor over to Dr. Karen Eggleston, Senior Fellow at FSI and Director of the Asia Health Policy Program. She will moderate the discussion. Thank you. Karen, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Kyo, and thank you all for joining us today. I direct our Asia Health Policy Program. I'm delighted to welcome you to our session today and introduce our 3 very special guest speakers. I want to start by saying that there are few aspects of society that are being transformed by technology more than health and medical care, with health systems being challenged to finance and deliver affordable access to this burgeoning array of technologies that may enable longer, healthier lives. But will it be available with equity, and how are health systems implementing that? Our 3 esteemed guest speakers will address different and complementary aspects of how several Asian health systems create, evaluate, and regulate transformative technologies. So I'll introduce them in the order they will speak. There will be time at the end for question and answer. So while they're speaking, please think about that and put your questions in the Q&A function on Zoom. Our first speaker is Dr. Sachiko Masuda, who is a visiting scholar here at Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center this year, was awarded an Abe Fellowship for her research, as an associate professor at the University of Tokyo Research Center for Advanced Science and Technology. Dr. Masuda received a PhD specializing in intellectual property law and a BS in pharmaceutical sciences from the University of Tokyo. Our next speaker is Dr. Jung-Hoon An, who is a professor at Ewha Women's University and an adjunct fellow at the National Evidence-Based Healthcare Collaborating Agency, NECA, both in Seoul, Korea. He worked for 7 years at NECA and served in various decision-making and advisory committees for public agencies, such as the Health Insurance Review and Assessment Services and Korean Centers for Disease Control. Our third speaker is Dr. Dean Ho, who is Provost Chair Professor, Director of the N1 Institute for Health, Director of the Institute for Digital Medicine, and Head of the Department of Biomedical Engineering at the National University of Singapore. He and colleagues developed Curate.ai. He's a fellow of the US National Academy of Inventors, the American Institute for Medical and Biological Engineering, has been a recipient of an NSF Career Award, among other honors. You can find more about each of our speakers on our website. Now we'll turn it over to Dr. Masuda.
Thank you. Today, I would like to talk about genetic and genomic information in Japan. The quantity and quality of genetic and genomic information grows worldwide. Since completing the Human Genome Project in 2003, and the introduction of next generation sequences in 2007, the quantity of GI has increased dramatically. Qualitatively, the past decade has also seen the clinical implementation of genomic medicine in many countries around the world, as well as the initiation of large-scale genomic cohort studies. These have rapidly expanded from SNPs to whole genome. Some genomic information still tends to scatter across various countries or institutions with silos of different amounts of data, source of information, and regulations. Since around 2015, precision medicine is gradually being implemented to attempt to dissolve these silos of information and encourage researchers to share and centralize data and utilize genomic information more efficiently for the future. In this context, I'd like to explain Japan's recent efforts for these silos of information regarding collecting and utilization of genomic information, both in infrastructure and legislation. I will conclude with a discussion of future policy issues. In Japan, 2 databases were released in 2018 as part of a data sharing initiative. The goal of GEM Japan project is to establish a nationwide alliance of universities, research institutes, and hospitals to promote data sharing and research use of genomic and clinical data. GEM Japan also joined an international consortium to support global data sharing across information silos. In addition to genomic information, biobanks in Japan are also beginning to collaborate to provide resources. Currently, there are more than 50 biobanks in Japan, and the major biobanks are working to establish a common and highly standardized database. Biobank Network began in October 2019 and provides researchers with one-stop cross-searching access to biospecimen and data from multiple biobanks. While data sharing and biobank network are intended only for research use, efforts to centralize genomic information have also begun to be shared within the health insurance system. In June 2019, when cancer genome profiling tests were first covered by Japanese national insurance, 12 core hospitals and more than 200 collaborating Japanese hospitals were selected and certified to conduct tests using genomic information. The patient sequence data and clinical information obtained by the test can be used for cancer treatment based on appropriate medical interpretation. At the same time, data is centralized and stored in the Center for Cancer Genomics and Advanced Therapeutics to build a knowledge database for future clinical application. Currently, patients eligible for this test is limited to those who have completed or have no standard treatment. Still, almost 100% of the patients enrolled so far have consented to secondary use of GI and patient information. The Personal Information Protection Law of 2015 challenges that genomic information, like other medical information, is protected as special care required personal information. This law also states rules for business operators that handle such information, like requiring the individual's consent to collect and utilize such information to third parties. However, there is not a single law protecting personal information, but rather 3 laws and more than 2,000 coexisting ordinances. Therefore, GI silos still exist in Japan due to personal information protection laws. Different legislation regulate businesses depending on which category they belong to in the private or public sectors. The ministries prepare guidelines for each business field to adjust this discrepancy of laws between the private and the public sectors. These are the main guidelines for genetic and genomic information. The ministries have issued guidelines for research, medical, and direct-to-consumer genetic testing. So this is currently a complex system, but this year, the 3 laws will be combined one law without crossover of responsibility. In addition, in 2018, the Next Generation Medical Infrastructure Law was enacted as a special law under the Personal Information Protection Law to break down information silos between sectors and promote sharing information in research and development across the medical field. The Next Generation Medical Infrastructure Law facilitates the anonymization and provision to third parties of medical information through authorized entity designated by the minister. This is expected to make it easier for hospitals and academic institutions to provide anonymized information and promote the use of information by non-academic institutions such as pharmaceutical companies. So I have introduced the recent efforts in Japan to realize precision medicine from the aspect of GI sharing, collection, and utilization. As precision medicine penetrates society in the future, we will need to face many practical and institutional policy issues. Those I mentioned today are only a few of the challenges ahead. For example, domestic issues include improving the public's genetic understanding, eliminating discrimination or anxiety, and fostering related industries that support genetic and genomic testing to enclose GI for domestic use. On the other hand, cross-border issues include medical disparities caused by the inequitable access to GI among countries. Although the perception of genetic and genomic information differs from country to country, it may be necessary to share policy issues in each country and consider the minimum international rules. So thank you very much for your attention.
And thank you very much for sharing your research with us. Next, we have Professor An talking about health technology assessment.
It is my great honor to speak in this distinguished webinar series. And I'm going to go over the Korean HTA system and a little bit of Asian HTA as a connection to the Korean system. And hopefully, if I have time, I'm going to show you the new ideas which are not implemented, but very interesting development currently we are debating. So this is my contents of today's talk. So a little bit background, Korea has about 50 million population, and it has a single payer national health insurance system. And also it has a government assistance, such as similar to Medicaid program, which covers about 3%. And the basic principle is fee for service, and that characterizes the Korean HTA system. A little bit background of our NHI. And this is how it works. We have the insurer, and we also have some independent review agency. So this is something like the claim processing agency, but they take more role than just the claim processing because they have the data system. So that's why it is also unique characteristic of the Korean HTA. So this is the three important health technology categories in Korea. We call it tracks. So drugs, medical devices, diagnostics and procedures, but actually diagnostics and procedures are overall on all the medical service part. So there is NECA, which generate HTA evidences or HTA reports. And also we have the regulatory agency, used to be called the KFDA, but now it is the Ministry of Food and Drug Safety. And we also have some committee for some kind of regulatory role for those service items. So one of the division in the NECA, well, we are going to see it later, is directly linked with this committee. And then basically the HERA, our claim processing agency, has power to recommend to the ministry for listing of those health technology. So they have their own professional expert committee on each track. Only for the drugs, we have a price negotiation at our payer. So actually, if you are a drug company, you submit the, after you getting regulatory approval, you submit the dossier to the HERA. And then after HERA's recommendation, you can start the price negotiation along with other legal contract with the payer. And then every decision is finalized at our Supreme Committee on Health Insurance Policy in the ministry. So this is the current system of drug reimbursement in Korea. So HERA review is 120 days from the, I should correctly say here, not the submission. The date HERA recognized submission is complete. So once they get the positive recommendation, it goes to the NHIS. So they start the price negotiation and they have to finish in 60 days. Otherwise, it is the no agreement path. And in the price negotiation, they also negotiate on price volume agreement and risk sharing agreement as well. And then again, the Health Insurance Policy Committee in the ministry will finalize the decision. And each step, if they cannot get the positive recommendation, they may request for independent review process. This is established after US-Korean FTA. And then also this arbitration of the price, which is another independent committee, they also decide the price negotiation, which failed to reach an agreement, only if the drug is an essential drug. So the role of NECA is what the HTA development in Korea. So NECA's fact sheet is covering the national, so all the national coverage and serving the whole population. And it has pretty sizable budget, about 15 million per year for the intramural research and the administration, plus about 20 million for the extramural grants on this clinical research to generate HTA evidence. So about 150 steps. And they host this new health technology assessment system, which is, I just explained, on the service items. So anybody who want to charge the service fee to the patient, they have to pass through this Committee of New Health Technology Assessment. And this is a unique system in Korean HTA. So we have a fee-for-service system. If there is no regulation at all, basically any non-covered service item can be charged to the patient, and it can go infinitely to increase our healthcare expenditure. So there is some gatekeeping as this Committee for New Health Technology Assessment. So some people saying that this is one of the two biggest institutional difference from the Japanese system, because our system is pretty close to the Japanese system. And one of the institutional difference is when you treat the patient with both covered item and non-covered item, in Korea, usually they bill separately only for the covered item to the HIRA, so that they can add any non-covered item as a patient out-of-pocket payment item, versus in Japan, which is basically illegal except for some limited cases. So that's why in Korean system, we have this Committee for New Health Technology Assessment is gatekeeping those non-covered items to be charged to the patient. They have to pass through. So actually this is HTA on non-insurance covered item, and which is very unique. So actually the procedural path is any new technology, they have to get the examination at the New Health Technology Assessment. If it is a service item, then they can go to the insurance application step. So if any technology passing the committee and failed to passing through the HIRA's insurance recommendation, then that can be charged as a non-covered item. But if any new health technology failed to pass this committee, then they cannot charge any money to the patient. They may do some research-based administration, but they cannot treat the patient and charge for the item. So that function is in this NECA. And the other important function is when we do a lot of health technology assessment, if there is no enough evidence or some evidence in the Korean patient, then it can be linked with this research grant program hosted in NECA, so that they can be selected as one of the grant program, and then they can collect the data from the clinical trials or prospective cohort studies and that sort of the research. So NECA's HTA is evidence-based, and it supports the rational decision making, and it provides those evidence for the physician practice, and also it helps to the population to get right technology to be covered in our healthcare system. So the HTA methods, they do systematic review and comparative effectiveness research, which is largely outcomes research, and also cost effectiveness analysis. Also, one of the keywords in the NECA's HTA is a reassessment, because this HTA system was started in 2007. That there are a lot of technologies already listed before the 2007. So some of the obsolete technologies, they may be reassessed, and they may be delisted to make a room for the new innovative technologies. So that is the reassessment. And there are several steps, some milestones of the HTA in Korea. And 2018 is the year the reassessment started, because our new president wants to extend the coverage for the national health insurance, so that we have to make a room for the budget. So this was a 2014 organization, but this lists the most extensive range of the HTA activities. So they have all these activities, but with a different organizational structure. But at 2004, they just divided by each service item at a HTA agency. So let me just skip there. So this is the life cycle management of health technology. So starting from the emerging technology, so they do horizon scanning activities. So NECA is a member of the Euroscan, which is the international network for horizon scanning. And when they see some promising health technology, but do not have enough evidence, then they grant their support the development part. And then new health technology is prepared with enough evidence, then they can submit it to the New Health Technology Assessment so that they will be reviewed at the Committee for New Health Technology Assessment. And then once it is in the Korean healthcare system, the various studies can be done, and then reassessment at the final stage of the life cycle. The old technology can be compared with the new technologies, so whether they have some importance in our healthcare system or our health system, so that some recommendation will be made. But many of these recommendations are not binding, meaning that the decision maker can take it or not, except for the New Health Technology Assessment. NECA's New Health Technology Assessment report is directly used in Committee for New Health Technology Assessment decision making. Okay, I was going very fast to show you the remaining slide. So HDASIA link was established in 2011. It actually started with NECA in Korea, and HITEP in Thailand, and CDE in Taiwan. So starting with the 3 agencies, but it was expanded very fast. Also, it is internationally recognized in some of the WHO regulations and many other parts. And also, I couldn't remember the exact year, but it is expanded to include Oceania. So now it is Asia Pacific. The network operates on informal and voluntary basis, so no membership fee or no requirement, except you have to attend annual conference. Also, no compulsory engagement. Every activity, each agency can choose to participate or not. Sorry. So objective, there are 3 objectives, but I think one of the most important one, actually not explicitly written here, is advocating HTA in the region. So these are some activities. One of the first activity was the willingness to pay threshold study in these Asian countries, because when you do cost effectiveness analysis, you need the threshold value. And if it is not studied in your country, a lot of difficulties in doing HTA. And this was one of the first joint activities, and also many other interesting activities. And most recently, this Japanese NIPH-led joint study on developing new preference-based measure in Asian countries. So these are current organizational members. There are 33 members from the region, and we also have 2 outside members. Currently, I believe it's a price list essay from the South Africa and some UK Global Health Institute in the some university. When you see organizational members in HDASIA link, there are some government or government-related agencies like NECA or HITEP, Thailand, C2H, which is the Japanese NIPH, National Institute of Public Health, housed center on HTA activity. But there are many university or some hospitals, like the National University of Singapore, School of Public Health, actually it's a medical school, and some hospital. But there are many academic members are also accepted in this network, because in Asia, there are not many HTA agencies. So anybody who is interested in HTA activity was joined in this network. Also, it might be the Asian characteristic, but somehow the organization members are changing when the important person is moving to the other agencies. So I used to be in NECA, but now I'm in the university. But my department is also organizational member in this network. So now we have many Australian institutes joined here. Also, I have to recognize the Chinese center, China National Health Development Research Center, CNHDRC, has this HTA unit, and they are linked with their National Insurance, Health Insurance Bureau. And that's also a government-related agency, currently doing a lot of important function. And Malaysian government housed two agencies. One is MATAS, they do medtech, medical technologies, and they also have pharmaceutical division, PSM. And other than that, there are many other regional or some committee, like Indonesian Health Technology Assessment Committee. This is a national committee. So each country has different form of HTA, but somehow we are all linked through this HDASIA link. Okay, so let me briefly go over my final part. In the current Korean HTA system, which is not perfect, but we want to improve it for better, and many ideas are suggested, and I want to share them with you here. So one of the biggest complaints on current Korean HTA system is from the drug companies. When they submit the dossier, it takes too much time to make the decision to introduce into our national health insurance. So I think I already hinted you, the HIRA's 120 days review frame start only after the complete submission. So company is saying that from the submission to the decision, it can take 2 years, but HIRA is saying the review only takes 120 days. But the difference is HIRA can ask for revision to make it complete. So during that time, whether you view it as a review or whether you view it as to complementing your original submission. So that's the biggest complaint. Then how can we speed up the process so that those new technology can be more quickly delivered to the patient who need them? And also many of those revision requests is relating to something called uncertainty. So if you do not have evidence on Korean patient, that's uncertain efficacy to the Korean patient, and somehow you have to prove that. And if you cannot prove it, it may link with the price cut or the revision of the model to lower the drug price. So one of the idea is basically we may change the review system because current Korean system do not have any review after reimbursement. So for the high cost drugs or high budget impact items, when they review for the introduction, maybe they do some contract linked with our real world evidence collection. And then in the initial review, all the uncertainties can be contracted to measure after reimbursement when they are used in Korea. And then they can reassess the value of the technology so that under the risk sharing agreement, they can have the financial refund contract possible. So they can refund the amount so that for the estimated value after using the post reimbursement efficacy or effectiveness for those technologies. So current system, when the submission is unclear, HIRA can request for the revision, but also for the uncertainty, if there is no evidence, the company cannot generate evidence right away, but still it is requested. So they have to come up with some idea how to explain this uncertain part. But that part is one of the these items make it the process very lengthy. So it can be contracted from the review process so that it can be measured after the reimbursement, and the value of the drug can be adjusted based on the post reimbursement review process or the evaluation process. So that is the suggest system, and it is not enforced. So it cannot be enforced system. Just the drug company can choose whether to go for the existing system, or they can voluntarily agree to have a contract when their post reimbursement review is certain value, they are promising to adjust their price up to that level. So that's one idea. And the other idea, nowadays, this real world evidence collection is very important for our HTA. Most of the outside world, it is requested by the drug companies to show the value of the drugs versus in Korea. It is interested by these public agencies like HERA to collect the actual effectiveness data from the patients so that they can be used to change the drug price or change the reimbursement criteria. So that has been two new ideas, and they are currently on debate. But actually, my personal criticism on the public agency directly collecting the data is there should be some measures to guarantee the collection is unbiased and it does not have any negative impact. Because the worst scenario is HERA and the pharmaceutical company can have a both win-win situation. So high-cost drugs show exactly the HERA reviewed effects, and then still the large budget is problematic. So there might be some occasional price cut, which we had only once in 2012. So that kind of system is not evidence-based, which is more likely administrative convenience-based system. So I think it is better to guarantee the quality of data collection to be used in public decision making or the HTA in Korea. Okay, so this is what I have prepared. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. An. And our next speaker is Dr. Ho.
Thank you so much for the kind invitation today. I'm going to speak briefly on how we're harnessing digital medicine to both impact how we deliver healthcare, as well as how we educate future innovators across the graduate through medical training spectrums. And so I'm visiting everybody today from the National University of Singapore, where I direct the Institute for Digital Medicine, also known as Wisdom, as well as the N1 Institute for Health, also known as N1. So I'm going to briefly just talk about what we do at Wisdom. And what we're doing is harnessing digital platforms to drive what we hope will be a change in the practice of healthcare. And we have a number of pillars that we focus on. And today I'm going to largely focus on these two here, which is the therapeutic or the interventional side of Wisdom, as well as how we innovate clinical trial design and implementation. And the goal here is to optimize the treatment of patients for everything from oncology to cognitive training. And to illustrate how we do this, I wanted to kind of highlight the team that makes this all happen and discuss the spectrum of stakeholders needed to bridge ideation with implementation, deployment, and ultimately scale up and then adoption. And so I direct this institute filled with wonderful investigators. And I just wanted to highlight briefly some of the key individuals that drive our work. And so one of them is Kiyuan Nyam, who is a practicing surgeon, but also an expert in AI. And he is essentially the steward of our hospital systems AI platform so that we can bridge patient data with interventional and diagnostic optimization processes with the various platforms that are being developed across the university. In fact, the first hire that we made out of Wisdom was Yoan, who is not an academic. He actually hails from the insurance industry. And we brought him in because with our research roadmap, it's essential for us to know early on what the KPIs we need to meet are in order for the technologies that we develop to have a chance for deployment and ultimately scale up and adoption. And so one thing we're actually trying to do as a technology organization is to prevent the over-technification of medicine. Our aim is to not create 50 apps and 50 wearables for every patient that we encounter, because we need to really bridge the reality. of being able to shepherd an idea forward and see it used in a practice-changing setting. I wanted to mention that we have faculty members in our institute that hail from the business school who work in operations, analytics, healthcare, economics, so on and so forth. And with this united team here, I'm going to showcase a couple of innovation use cases of what we're doing at Wisdom to enhance patient treatment. Before that, I did want to stress again that Wisdom specializes in optimizing intervention. We think that's unique because by and large, a lot of the AI platforms that are being developed out there focus on diagnostics. And that's an important area. And we work with a lot of researchers as well as companies in this space. But again, we specialize in optimizing treatment. And with that, it comes with the need to have a clinical trial design team that knows how to innovate in that space, regulatory expertise, as well as a team of clinicians who are really residing at that interface of innovation in treatment, as well as their role in helping us calibrate patients and acquire very unique and individualized data sets for us to do what we do. So I want to start off with an innovation case, what I call modulated medicine. Oftentimes, as we may be familiar with, in oncology, patients, when they're given treatment, are often given very high dose and fixed dose therapy. And we keep administering these therapies until they no longer respond. And in many cases, these patients don't respond at all right off the bat. I'm going to give a couple of examples here. So here we had a patient that was brought to us who had advanced prostate cancer, metastatic. And this patient was being treated with 2 drugs. One was approved, one was investigational. And the patient was responding, but the toxicity was enormous. And so the patient was considering quitting this trial. And this was more or less the last option for this patient. And so with a very small amount of data, right, we use only a patient's own data to manage only their own care. And what we were able to find was actually, with our Curate platform, a 50% dose reduction would actually increase the efficacy for this patient. And naturally, it was a bit hard for the clinicians to be okay with that. But after getting the approvals, consulting the doctors, consulting the patient, we ultimately did drop that dose. And the patient's cancer markers dropped immediately within a week to the lowest levels they'd ever seen. And then over the course of treatment, we kept the dose low, the markers went down even lower. And then we started dynamically dosing this patient, which is it's not aligned with standard of care high dose therapy. But this patient achieved a remarkable outcome, halted disease progression, and ultimately regained an active lifestyle. Another patient was brought to us with a GI cancer. And this was a particularly interesting case because the patient initially did not respond at all to this treatment. But using only a little bit of data from, again, only this patient's own data to manage only their own care, we actually dropped one of the drug doses by about 50% also. And this patient flipped from becoming a non-responder to a responder, which is quite profound because this patient was about to be moved on to another line of treatment. And we would have completely forgotten about this line that they appeared to not respond to, where in fact they could respond. And to move things forward, we have a separate team that is assessing the cost savings per patient. Because we're allowed to now run these N of 1, these truly individualized studies, we can also run individualized cost savings studies. Savings to the patient by reducing the amount of drug they need. Some of these are very expensive drugs. And also savings to the healthcare system by reducing readmission for adverse events. And so, for example, one of the patients, we were saving them thousands of dollars a month from their therapy alone. Didn't even include the fact that prior to our stepping in, they were being readmitted every time they tried to administer a drug to this patient, right? This particular patient was being told that they had no more options. They still wanted to try. They were being readmitted every time a new drug was tried until we stepped in and found a better drug and dose, which allowed them ultimately to respond to care. And it takes an amazing team to make this happen, of clinicians, of engineers, and our admin team going above and beyond the call of duty to bridge a number of stakeholders, from engineers to clinicians to finance offices, to regulators, to ministries of health, our equivalent of the FDA, the Health Sciences Authority, amazing organizations, all coming together, including data protection offices to rapidly develop solutions with life-saving outcomes. A second innovation case I'm going to talk about is digital therapeutics. And this has become, the need for digital therapy has become even more apparent during the time of COVID. And this is essentially a video game. It's a video game that's paired with our Curate platform. We're not using pharmacologic intervention. We're not using pills. We're using a game as an intervention. And we're dynamically changing the intensity of the game to then modulate and optimize the intensity down the road for improved cognitive performance. And we can do this remotely. This is done on tablet. And this tablet also simultaneously serves as a diagnostic where we can remotely monitor cognitive trajectory of the users. We are using this, we just got approval to implement this for a seniors community. We are already running a trial now for brain cancer patients. We're running a very large study for healthy subjects. Again, not only to look at cognitive trajectory, but we have a team of behavioral scientists integrated into this to understand user interface, user experience, what factors will improve uptake and improve adherence, because this is critical information as we move this down the road towards downstream regulatory as well as reimbursement. But we're seeing promising outcomes where the Curate optimized training is resulting in the best scores observed in the training sessions compared to kind of standard fixed intensity training. And we're getting great feedback from our users across both the healthy subjects as well as the neuro-oncology patients to really help us in a co-creation process. Again, all towards downstream regulatory as well as improved adherence and uptake. Final use case I'm going to show you is a COVID-19 use case where we developed a platform called Identify, not only for COVID, but for broad pandemic preparedness, as well as antimicrobial resistance. And so one thing I will say with our AI, whether it's Curate, whether it's individualizing care, or whether it's optimizing drug combination designed for the broader population, something that that our collaborators, that our clinical partners have found, something that they've really liked about our platforms is that we do not use big data. We don't take large amounts of data from the population to feed into an algorithm to make predictions about how to dose patients or how to combine drugs. We only use prospectively acquired, very calibrated data and very small amounts of data that's experimentally validated to drive an optimization process that was discovered with AI. In fact, we've simplified it so much that we actually don't even use AI anymore. And this is why we have moved towards integrating this AI-based approach into broadly deployable drug development settings as well as clinical validation settings. So what we did here was we took a big pool of therapeutics, and instead of predicting drug targets or predicting drug interaction, we did a prospective validation on live virus, revalidated our combinations in the beta and the delta variants, and we will be validating this against Omicron in about 2 weeks. And we were able to, again, develop combinations that are realized from an optimization perspective, not purely a drug sensitivity perspective. Because as we move downward towards, again, regulatory, broader deployment, clinical validation, the outcomes from optimization and the outcomes from traditional drug sensitivity are very different from each other. And we've seen this in the clinic, in particular for our oncology patients already. And so my last slide, things that we've learned through our process, which I think are going to be critical as we further advance our technologies toward deployment, is that optimization and traditional development are not the same thing. And given the amazing agility as well as accessibility of stakeholders in our ecosystem in Singapore, we do have a chance to reimagine how we innovate everything from the discovery of new drugs to the development of those drugs, to the validation of the drugs using novel trial designs, all the way into the hospital, how we individualize the administration of these therapies. It takes this, again, accessibility of stakeholders, from research to policy to regulatory, all the way to operations, analytics, behavioral economics, and beyond. I think what's been exciting here is that we now have an understanding here that it's not just about how much data we have, but it's how that data is acquired. When we want to truly optimize treatment, it actually takes a lot less data than we think we need, but it takes the right amount of data. And that's why all of our data is prospectively acquired. We don't take 1,000 patients worth of data to train an algorithm to treat the 1,001st patient that walks in the door. Finally, I will say that as head of department, and as well as through other work that I do, what we've learned from the technical domain, I think has really helped inform us for everything from education all the way to very downstream implementation. What I'll say is something that we believe very strongly is that technology alone cannot transform healthcare. And that's why at Wisdom, again, we have healthcare economists, behavioral scientists, operations, analytics, all the way down to insurance expertise and payer expertise. Something that we have found is that interdisciplinary empathy is essential. When we think about empathy in healthcare, we often think about healthcare provider, doctor to patient. But I think something that's allowed us to bridge our technology with very innovative trial designs and important patient outcomes is the element of interdisciplinary empathy, so that we can build healthcare systems that champion equity, accessibility, and practice-changing healthcare. And when I talk about interdisciplinary empathy, I talk about from doctor to patient, engineer to nursing teams, engineer to pharmacy teams, to clinical teams, and beyond into, again, regulatory healthcare, economics, and beyond. And again, this is just, again, some of the expertise that we have in our team that helps drive this. Final thing I'll say is what I've highlighted again. We all know that patients are different from each other, but it's important to note that patients are different from themselves over time, which means once we develop better ways to intervene, patients are always evolving. And that's why when we look at dynamically modulating dose or intensity of treatment, it is essential that we use, in our case, only a patient's own data to manage only their own care. And when we use only a patient's own data, instead of large amounts of data from people around the world, we're also looking to overcome bias and how bias in data can impede the optimization of patient outcomes. And so we use a very true N-of-1 approach. And to do that, again, it takes a lot of stakeholders to help us figure out ways to scale this and to ultimately deploy this. And so with that, that concludes my presentation. Again, I wanted to thank everybody for joining in today and happy to answer questions.
Well, thank you all very much. Listeners today, if you could put any questions you have in the Q&A function, I'd be gathering questions to pose to each of our speakers. And maybe it makes sense to go in reverse order, given the topic recently discussed is most fresh in minds. So I wanted to invite Dr. Ho to elaborate a little bit more. You mentioned this issue of focusing not only on efficacy and safety and quality for the individual patient and the treatment, but also actually demonstrating cost savings and engaging with a whole ecosystem of stakeholders. So I would invite you to talk about what your experiences have been like about that in Singapore, and also how that relates to your work with the WHO on lessons learned outside of Singapore, please.
Yes, and so, you know, I hail from an engineering faculty, an engineering school, and I think what's really exciting about being part of an engineering program is that we see all kinds of innovation on a constant basis. And very recently at NUS, we integrated design and engineering together. So we now have a new College of Design and Engineering, which is even more exciting because engineering and thinking up new ideas is a gateway, but how we further develop these innovations in a way so that users will want to use them and keep wanting to use them becomes essential for us as well. But at the same time, we don't want to kind of create this massive collection of technologies that have a hard time getting used. And so engineers, I think, typically were not traditionally trained to think about cost effectiveness and the metrics needed to achieve that. And by the way, how they might be differentially assessed depending on different healthcare systems and different geographies and jurisdictions we're thinking about. I think if you ask any engineer, would you like your technology to save a life? If that's the intent, of course they would say yes. Would you like your technology to be used by patients around the world? Of course, they would say yes. But at the end of the day, when we see technologies that are being used around the world, the validation of the technology is implicit, right? That's a given. There's so much more that has to be considered. I remember a talk that I sat in on many years ago where it was a room of amazing innovators, and someone whose expertise was on healthcare systems said, "Hey, look, these are amazing technologies, but I'm sorry, most of this will never be used in a healthcare setting. Because in this particular country, this very small number of patients accounts for 80-something% of the healthcare costs in the country focus on chronic disease. So where does your technology fit into an ecosystem that someone will pay for it?" Right. And so right now, and to be honest, when we first stepped into validating AI to improve cancer patient treatment, we weren't thinking about how much money are we saving the patient? How much are we saving the healthcare system? Where do we get this data? Right. And by the way, what will the payers be interested in for them to even want to look at this? Net monetary benefit. How much do we have to show that we can implement this for so that we are better than the alternative that is out there? Because there are a lot of alternatives. And so I've had the privilege to speak to those way outside of my expertise for the past few years, again, to better understand how we run these studies that we're starting to run now, in understanding where the cost savings need to be and what type of metrics we need to hit. And so I currently serve as a subgroup lead at the World Health Organization's AI for Health working group in the regulatory consideration space. And so on a regular basis, we have the opportunity to engage with regulators from around the world also to better understand how should we advance AI? How can we all collaborate and cooperate to figure out ways to really move AI into the clinic? What are our actual expectations of AI? Not just technical, but in terms of impact on healthcare systems so that we can understand where the goalposts are. And I think the final thing I'll say is when we developed our COVID platform for drug optimization, we know drug optimization. We know how to pick good combinations that will work for patients. But we spent 2 weeks running that platform and we found some really cool combinations. We spent well over 2 months understanding things like supply chain, which is not our expertise, going way outside of our bubble to figure out how will our ideas really make it to people. And to make this happen, what's been unique about Singapore is the true accessibility of every stakeholder. If I need to speak to regulators, if I need to speak to those who will tell us what we need to prove so that we can explore payer side considerations, we're talking about a time scale of, in some cases, even hours to a few days to speak to those who we need to interact with. And I think that in many cases can be unprecedented in terms of that level of accessibility. And when that happens, lives get saved. Lives get saved. The effectiveness of healthcare can get improved at a time scale that's also much faster. And so that's why it's been a real privilege to be a part of this ecosystem here in Singapore. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to turn next to Professor An and invite you to, in light of what you heard from our other speakers, but of your own presentation, a question for you. You talked about advocacy for HDASIA link. So what is the evidence that you present to advocate, or evidence of the impact of HTA in Korea or elsewhere?
I think it's a very good question. I will be away from my mic. Okay, so basically each country, when they started HA system, that's totally new, which it never existed in any of our country. So this is a new thing. So when we explain to our policymakers, this is used in other countries and they have some success, but they think that's two different system from the Korea. But if we explain, Japanese system can introduce this new HTA or they have some success, or on the other hand, Chinese Communist Party wanted to decide some number of the expensive Da Vinci machines or expensive health technologies, then basically Korea's HTA report or Canadian agencies' HTA report on those specific technologies can be used to adjust how much they want to import or how much they needed into their public hospitals. So that kind of interactions are greatly viewed as success stories, and then they can be delivered to other countries. HTA can impact or make our healthcare system better. So that kind of voices, instead of their own people saying, we are going there to deliver our own success stories, to kind of enforcing HTA system in other Asian countries. And at the exactly same way, when we are in danger, HTA is dealing with stakeholders. Sometimes they go to the Congress to very harshly attacking the HTA system. Then basically we need help from our fellow HTA agents people to speak how to solve those conflicts or how to make the system better.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Masuda, in your presentation, you had mentioned that almost 100% of patients involved had actually granted consent for use of their genomic information for later research. I wonder if you could share your thoughts on that number, and if that has any policy relevance going forward. How should we think about that?
Okay, thank you very much asking me the question. So this is, I think, a very important issue to considering promoting genetic medicine. So as of October 2021, the number of registered patients by the cancer testing is about 24,000. And indeed, 99.7% of them have given their consent for secondary use of the information, GI or clinical information. So consent from patient is one of the issues that must be taken into consideration because a patient are generally considered to be socially vulnerable. So this high consent rate should be paid attention to in the future, I think. So of course, the genetic information and patient data for secondary use, in this case, will be anonymized and will be used under the personal information protection law. And it is, of course, emphasis in the informed consent process that genomic medicine is available without without consent for secondary use. But consideration should be given to how patient perceive this kind of information. So whether it is pressure or not.
Thank you. So maybe I could turn it back to Dr. Ho to ask then, on an individual patient basis then, is there data? I know there's N of 1 use of their own data for their own treatment, but then is it consented to use more generally to have inform how you might think about using other patients' individual data to optimize their treatment, or how is that part of your process?
Yes, so right now we are essentially, we're still aggregating individualized data, because we believe that once we hit a threshold amount and we start to see subpopulations emerge, because there inevitably will be subpopulations that emerge from that, that maybe that type of subpopulation data acquired under optimization circumstances may potentially help inform more population-driven guidelines. One of our first clinical trials that we ran prospective was to optimize transplant dosing. And at the time, we had asked our clinical collaborators, how were your starting doses selected? And they had subpopulation starting doses outlined. How were the drug targets outlined? And that's all from population-based data. And it can be driven by demographics. But the thing is, if you line up two patients who have the same genetics, same disease, same drugs, same everything, and you give them these therapies, they're still going to respond differently from each other. So if at a population level, if we're taking suboptimal data, aggregating it all together to inform the next person that walks in, at the end of the day, there's a lot of noise there. And so, and not only that, we found that a lot of the longitudinal data is not missing. And if there is longitudinal data, it's not optimized either. And so there's this whole galaxy of data that doesn't exist. Yes, sometimes a doctor might change a dose in oncology because the drug's too toxic, but they won't measure the response to that lower dose efficacy-wise. They'll get the tox data. But for some patients, if you drop the dose, as we've seen, the efficacy can actually go up, right? And a lot of that data is missed. So we're kind of starting from scratch, making sure we take the N of 1 data and not only collect it longitudinally, but optimize treatment along the way. And then once we get enough of that, I think we're going to be rebuilding data sets that are quite compelling. And one thing we will find is that we may need less patients to determine whether or not a treatment modality is indeed effective or not. Because I will say, our goal with our N of 1 data, et cetera, our goal is not to low dose every cancer patient that walks in. Many more, like by and large, the majority of patients will need clinical levels of dosing, standard dosing. But what we are seeing is that with these N of 1 approaches, we are capturing more responders, which means people who are initially perceived to not respond to treatment are actually able to respond to this treatment, where you don't even change the drug, you just change the dose. And they go from not responding to responding. So if that happens, you can imagine this will impact oncology, cardiology, everything you can imagine. And if you're able to capture more responders with N of 1, then you may very well need less patients to truly figure out if something works or doesn't work. And then those data sets that we're getting will be a foundation for more compelling population-wide medicine.
Thank you. So as we come to the end of our time together, I invite each of you to think for a moment if you have any final thoughts you'd like to share. Well, having heard each other's perspectives, I want to first turn what we just discussed over to Professor Ahn, if I might. If you have any final thoughts, add them. But first, a question. How would this dynamic dosing modulated medicine be treated as a technology under Korea's system? Would that be subject to health technology assessment? In what way?
I think it's a very delicate question, because traditionally administration of the drug is not considered as a health technology, even though many of our companies claim the benefit from the different administration of the same drug is kind of beneficial. I personally agree that actually it can have the differences, but unless it is a form of some data technology or a form of something with shape and feature and, how can I say, more likely to be recognized as our regulatory agency and insurance system, unless that kind of more concrete form, I don't think just the technology itself cannot be viewed as our traditional 3 tracks, unfortunately.
Dr. Masuda, do you have any parting questions or thoughts to share?
Yes, I have a question for Professor An. So I'm very interested in use HTA system for diagnosis or process uncovered by insurance. So do you have any actual case for HTA to such kind of products?
Oh yeah, actually there are many. So every year, I think about 100 applications coming into that part because let's say some doctor invented the new surgical techniques, and it requires some product which get our regulatory approval, but somehow it involved with more difficulty in surgery. So the physician want to receive more fee schedule. But the only way to get it done is to have the new procedure less listed as other technology than existing surgical technique. So for that kind of purpose, a lot of applications coming in, and basically if it is passing through the Committee for New Technology, then it has some chance of getting it recognized as a new insurance item. So just like if it was in situation in Japan, the doctor would have applied directly to Juikyo, and then basically their fee schedule determination will be the access to the new technology. But in Korea, basically there are additional steps. You have to first recognize it as a new technology item from the Committee for New Technology Assessment, and then it goes to the insurance review agency to be passing through the insurance. So somehow we have more like a two-step approach than the Japanese system.
Thank you.
Yes, and maybe inviting final thoughts from Dr. Ho. I might also throw in a question that just came in and invite any of the speakers that want to respond after Dr. Ho. But basically, what are the most important things to pay attention to if we want to best leverage health technologies going forward? Dr. Ho, you first.
Yeah, I would say the theme that I think I've been talking about most of today has been engaging with the stakeholders involved in the spectrum of innovation, but after the technology is developed. I think we do spend a lot of time focusing on validating the technology to see a good quantifiable clinical outcome. But again, that's a given, right? If we're going to see something make it into a healthcare system, it has to work. It has to work well. And if we wait until the end to start having these discussions with the stakeholders down the road, from the economic side, behavioral implementation, all of the above, a lot of times this is where technologies hit barriers. A very simple example, we currently have a clinician, but from industry, who runs trials for a very large pharma company, working with us, basically on sabbatical. And the only thing that we talk about on a daily basis really is how much time does it take for us to calculate an optimal dose for a patient, whether it's, again, for hypertension, again, or for oncology, transplant, and beyond. And, a few years ago, we'd tell them 30 minutes, all right? As of last week, it could be 2 minutes. There's a reality. With the number of patients clinicians see in Asia or in the US or in Europe, if you're going to add 30 minutes per patient every day, it's a non-starter, right? There's really no point. No matter how good the technology is, it's pretty hard to implement. And he has shared stories about how they've had amazing diagnostics and other products that can potentially change practice. They're just too hard to integrate into clinical practice. And so having these types of discussions now versus later is essential. Knowing which questions to ask, which I think starts with being able to engage with this community of stakeholders, is essential. And by the way, I still think 2 minutes is too long. So we still have these discussions on a regular basis of how we no longer think about optimizing the technology, but it's about optimizing how we deploy it.
Dr. An, Dr. Masuda, anything you would like to add with your parting thoughts?
I think that it's also connected to my previous answer to that optimizing the dose technology, whether it will be going through our HTA. Even though it may not be going through HTA, I think one of the important leveraging item for this health technology is is it worthwhile to introduce? So this question is very important throughout the Korean HTA system and many other parts. I agree that this optimizing dose is definitely worthwhile, but somehow it does not necessarily going through our HTA review. Instead, some clinical research and some evidence generated, then it may be directly going to our HIRA or any other insurance-related agency. They want to go through their deliberation process directly so that it will be just implemented throughout the nation. They do not need the HTA process at all there. Just it has a good enough evidence. It can save the budget or it can be beneficial without much budget impact. That can be just introduced directly by the public side.
Thank you. Any other final thoughts? Well, thank you all to our three wonderful speakers, and thank you all for joining us today. Stay well.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks again.